welcome to our second episode of Building Audacity series, Civically Speaking, a podcast and show where Boston youth host real conversations with 2021 Boston mayoral candidates and community members. We ask tough questions on homelessness, food justice, health equity, racial justice, and more to learn about our guests' values and vision for greater Boston and Boston proper. Civically Speaking is here to help you learn more about local elections and make an informed decision this fall. So, whatever you do, let's organize and get out and vote. Civically Speaking is presented by Building Audacity. Building Audacity is a nonprofit that envisions freedom and power for the most marginalized individuals and communities. We empower youth aged 11 to 25 to identify the changes they would like to see in their community and provide them the tools to lead that change. Our youth led projects include providing fresh groceries to over 500 food insecure families throughout Greater Boston to challenge food apartheid as part of our weekly food distribution program, increasing access to therapy, doula care, and infant care products for Black and Brown birth givers, building an experiential learning hydroponic center to grow fresh produce by our community, for our community, and more. At Building Audacity, we think listening is the first step in learning. We hope you enjoy this
We're
episode.
so excited to be joined by City Councilor at Large, Annissa Essaibi George. Welcome. You are our first, candidate guest and our second guest in the series. So thank you so much for joining us. And please tell us about yourself and your campaign.
No, thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm so happy to be here with you to talk about me and my campaign, my work on the Boston City Council, and what I hope to do as mayor of this city. As you mentioned, my name's Annissa Essaibi George, and I am a proud Bostonian, born and raised in the Dorchester neighborhood, Dorchester section of the city of Boston, graduate of the Boston Public Schools, and now a parent of 4 BPS students. I'm a former teacher, so I spent a lot of my work speaking of education, talking about the Boston Public Schools in particular, and talking about the implications of COVID, inadequate access to high quality ed, certainly some of the systemic challenges we face in the Boston Public Schools, and more. I'm also a small business owner, so I'm very interested in our local economy, both when we think about the city of Boston as a whole, but also thinking very specifically about what I call our micro economies when we think neighborhood by neighborhood and business district by business district, and how when they are successful, our communities are also successful. And when they face challenges, our neighborhoods also face challenges. So it's a really important part of my work on the Boston City Council and everything in the middle, everything in between all of that. I am also a candidate for mayor of Boston and looking forward to leading this city through a period of recovery post-COVID into what I hope is a period of great growth, great change, and great success, especially for our young people. I have a particular interest in the success of our kids across our city. I often use a hashtag I refer to as City Kids Win, because when we create opportunities, not just in the field of play, I happen to be a mother of 4 athletes. I am a former athlete myself and coach when I was teaching, and think that when we create opportunities for our kids to win, whether it's on the ball field or in the classroom or in the workplace, but in our city, we're creating opportunities for our city to win. So I think that's a quick snapshot about me. Happy to talk a little bit more about my family history, how I sort of ended up in this role, which is sort of an interesting pathway. Certainly owe a lot to both my parents. Both my parents immigrated to the United States, have 2 very different immigration stories, but both have impacted me in the trajectory of my life pretty significantly. And would love to chat about that too, if you want to talk about that at all.
And thank you for the wonderful introduction to yourself, Counselor. And your introduction actually lends itself very well to our first question. And thinking about how you plan on entering this role as mayor. And so our first question is, and I'll read, we are well over a year into what many have referred to as a double pandemic,
Mhm.
that is, of racial discrimination and the coronavirus. And there appears to be hope on the horizon. What is the most valuable lesson from this period, and how does this influence the leadership you plan on taking up?
No, thank you very much for the question. And if I could just add to this, the challenge of this double pandemic, both the public health crisis that COVID has presented itself, as well as a more globally recognized pandemic around racism. And that has been here, that has been part of our city's experience. It's been part of our society's experience. It is nothing new, especially for too many Bostonians here in our city, but certainly across the country. And we've seen that play out certainly on our television screens if we haven't lived it in person ourselves. But I want to also add that because of these pandemics, because of these challenges we face as a society, both a true health crisis when we think about illness and we think about the spread of COVID-19, but also the implications of systemic racism, we are also faced with, unfortunately, a mental health crisis that is both present and ever looming, especially when we think about the return to more normalcy, especially with the light at the end of the tunnel. I do fear that I have been saying more and more recently that I've said for a long time, I fear that the next crisis is a mental health crisis, but I do fear more and more that it is here, it is with us. It is certainly about our young people. It is certainly about our elders, our oldest residents who have lived for a very long time in isolation. But it's about our communities who have experienced a tremendous amount of loss, a tremendous amount of challenges, especially around loss of employment, loss of family members, loss of access to support services and things that are very critical to living a full life. But I also worry about the implications of everything that has been ongoing while most of us have been just focused on COVID. Trauma has persisted, poverty has persisted, food insecurity, although we are much more aware of it and much more responsive to it, especially over this last year, that was always here, that always existed. I know homelessness is really important to all of you. It's been a great deal of my work on the city council around individuals experiencing homelessness, families experiencing homelessness. That too has persisted over this time, and all of those realities never went away because COVID arrived and most of the world was publicly focused on COVID. These challenges have continued to exist. And as a former teacher and someone who spends a lot of time in the education space, educational inequities have persisted. Lack of opportunity to access rigorous academic instruction has persisted. The inadequate opportunity to participate in enrichment activities, whether it's athletics, whether it's arts and music, whether it's hanging out with your friends, after school for a little while, like all of those challenges have been there, existed before COVID, and have just simply, I think, been magnified because of COVID. And on the other side of COVID will still be there. And I worry about the trauma that brings to so many of our young people across our city, but in particular, just our communities at large.
Thank you very much. And so I heard during your interview, you spoke a lot about your experience as an educator. And so, as an educator, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these words the famous historian and educator Carter G. Woodson offered. He is someone whom many refer to as, quote, the father of Black history. But in his work and in his life and work, uh, he made a direct connection between the violence Black people experienced in society and the ideas they learned in schools. First, what is your take on Woodson's perspective, given our current state of affairs? And second, how might you respond from the perspective of policy and or programming?
Well, I don't know that quote in particular, so I'd love to see it in its full context, but for sure, what is reflected both in our textbooks and what we learn in our schools is, sort of this challenging cycle of what we see too often in our communities and how that impacts how we interact with content or curriculum in our classroom. And that sort of that cycle of I don't know how to explain it, but just sort of the conflict that creates and the lack of a full opportunity for our kids to engage in curriculum that is meaningful, that is culturally relevant, and that is presently applicable to life is so incredibly important. I, as a member of the Boston City Council, in particular, my focus on education as chair of the Committee on Education, we've been working to bring a more full experience around in rolling out an ethnic studies curriculum into the Boston Public Schools in a way that's more than just a class or a course that a student could sign up for, that it should be embedded across all of our curriculum areas, and part of how it informs both how the educator delivers instruction, but also how children experience instruction. I would also say that too often, especially with our Black and brown boys in particular, I'm a mother of 4 boys, so I'm particularly interested in how boys interact with curriculum, with instruction, with classroom settings, because we do know that boys in particular do receive instruction and participate in their academic experience in a very different way than girls do. And so much of our instruction and our pedagogy in a classroom is designed around what might be described as a typical student. We know that no child is a typical child, and instruction needs to be catered and presented in a way that a child can interact with it and receive it and learn and grow because of it. But one particular interest of mine has been the impact of special education and sub-separate classrooms on our Black and brown boys in particular. And when we are setting aside our boys from sort of the quote unquote regular education experience, regular ed classroom, and setting them separate, I believe that there creates a lack of, doesn't create anything. It takes away opportunity. It creates a true barrier to access opportunities, both academic, but also social, certainly emotional, access to what our school community should be doing for our children. And we talk very directly about the school to prison pipeline. When we see children behaving in more aggressive ways, when we see instances where police may have to intersect with our school communities, it is often through those sub-separate classrooms. And I believe that is the direct, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, they go right through our sub-separate classrooms and disproportionately impact our Black and brown boy students in particular. Although we're seeing more and more female students fall into the same way, there is a huge disparity between boys and girls in that particular place.
Thank you for your thoughtful response.
I think as a city in particular, but certainly as a society in general, but I'm running for mayor of Boston and my focus is on our city and our city's kids. I do think that is one place where we have really failed so many of our students. Our charge, especially within the school system, but as in government, our charge is to educate our kids, our young people across our city. And I feel in very, with very broad brushstrokes, we eliminate the possibility for kids to learn, to achieve, to succeed, to thrive, to live full lives when we put them in sub-separate classrooms. And that also takes from the child's experience who needs that specialized instruction, who needs that very small, intimate learning environment. There's no one gains in those situations. And the student that truly does need that environment loses. And the children that we inappropriately place in those environments also loses. And as an educator, as a former classroom teacher, as someone who's very interested in our education system here in Boston and wants to work to fix the parts that are broken, this is one of the first places where we need to start.
On the subject of supporting our young people in Boston and Greater Boston, Building Audacity is a youth-led organization, and we find the perspectives of youth critical to any vision of the city's future. So as future mayor, how do you plan on supporting youth-led change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I appreciate you asking it because it gives me an opportunity to reflect on some of my own experiences as a, one second, I have a dog and he's got his toy and he's right under my feet. Where's Astro? Can I see you, puppy? Oh, where's the squeaker? Just toss this. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Sorry. Thank you. So I appreciate that question very much because it does give me an opportunity to reflect on my own experiences as a young person in this city, going to high school here. I went to Boston Tech, which is now the John D. O'Brien School of Math and Science. But as a student at Boston Tech, I truly did find and discover my love for Boston politics, for municipal government. And in some of our earlier conversations, we were talking about politicians, and it was almost said in a bad word. I think that being politically engaged makes you a politician. Being able to navigate some of these conversations makes you a politician. I think it's a good word, and I'm proud to be a politician. I'm proud to be an elected official. But it was during those high school years that I became, I think, more civically engaged and more aware of what civic engagement could lead to. And I became very involved in student government at my high school. I became involved in the Boston Student Advisory Council, refer to it as BSAC, that eventually led to my involvement in the State Student Advisory Council. So we worked on some statewide issues, but truly recognized as a young person the power my voice had, or the power that my voice sometimes had, because there were certainly opportunities, and it was actually an opportunity, a debate of sorts, a conversation, a discussion with a local leader that really inspired me and motivated me to consider running for office someday. Obviously, I didn't run for office the first time until much later in life, but that exchange and that experience sat with me for a very long time. And for me to engage young people in discussion, in discourse, in conversation, and to make sure that their voices are heard, especially on the issues that most impact them. And we do, unfortunately, often limit young people to only be involved in conversations around education, where I do think it should be so much more than that. Certainly the Boston Student Advisory Council, BSAC, has a very direct relationship with the Boston School Committee and the school department. So there is a great, a significant amount of their work and their responsibility is around education, and in particular as it relates to the Boston Public Schools. But they, as a group, have ventured into other areas and other areas of interest. The mayor has the Mayor's Youth Council, which is engaged, again, not just with BPS students. It's a larger group of young people that are, discussing issues of importance to them and relevant to the city beyond education. I've actually had before the city council an ordinance to form what we've been referring to as a city council, youth council. Whether that would end up being its final name, I don't know. So I do believe that the Boston City Council should have its own network of young people that are formally engaged in the work of the city council. And what we've envisioned, and this hasn't been formalized yet, we've still been working through, we've presented it before the council, and we've been working it through some central staff to understand how this could really work and be an effective tool to communicate with and have young people inform the work of the city council. But for me, I see it as a way to engage youth from across the city, so certainly representative of the neighborhoods and the districts that city councilors represent today, but also a very direct relationship with the various committees of the city council. So whether it's the Ways and Means Committee, which is the budget, one of the most important functions of the city council, whether it's the Environment Committee, again, another really important aspect of our work on the city council, the Education Committee for sure, our Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, our Government Operations Committee, which looks at sort of the ordinance and any city laws that we're looking to pass. And we have a Veterans Affairs, we have a City Services Committee, we have an Arts and Culture Committee, and young people should be involved in those discussions. They should be directly involved in those discussions and have opportunities to truly inform the work that we do as a city council. Similarly to the way that the mayor utilizes the Mayor's Youth Council and the school department and the school committee utilize BSAC. I think it's a really important thing for us to do as local leaders, as government officials, to engage young people. And as much as I can have conversations with younger people, and it informs my work, creating formal channels to invite young people to sit at the table is, I think, an important element. And it's also in all aspects of my work, whether I was teaching, I have a small business in my business, whether it's in community organizations, whether it's I'm on the board for my health center, that bench strength is a really important concept to always be watching. And so creating bench strength for the future, it's a sports analogy where, your pitcher is, just flailing and, just can't throw a strike and is just getting hit left and right. Who's on the bench? Who can we pull in that can cover for, step in and do the work? Bench strength is really important in organizations. It's really important in community-based efforts. It's important in the private industry. When we think about a big bank, who's on the bench? Who's going to, if the CEO retires tomorrow, who's going to step in? And how have we, whether it's an organization, a corporation, or government, how have we prepared that next group of leaders to come in and continue with the work? And the best way to do that is have them at the table, learning and informing and participating.
Councilor, I would like to just follow up really quickly on the last point you just made a while ago. It was the, I know you mentioned the school to prison pipeline, and in that sort of explanation of how you felt about specific students being targeted by police, I would just like to know, where do you stand on the issue of police presence in our public schools in the Commonwealth? Was that something you before or against?
So I'm a former high school teacher in Boston. I taught for 13 years at East Boston High School, and I'm very proud of my years of service and the opportunity to teach our students, teach our kids, and to really learn from our kids too through that process. As a school teacher, I also had school resource officers present in my building that worked very closely with our kids, that worked with our school administration, that worked with me, and were very much engaged in that school community. I found them to be a value add to my experience in the school, and certainly they had the presence of a uniformed force. They did wear a uniform, and they were certainly there should anything happen in our school. But for me and for the relationships I had with my students and what I knew from my students, they were always considered part of, and a positive part of, our school community. And in many ways, I feel that our students felt a certain level of safety, an additional safety, because they were in our school. I would also add that there is sort of this interesting relationship when we think about the Boston Public Schools, school police, and their relationship with the Boston Police Department and their school police unit, which also works closely with our school police, should they need to be, but not based in our schools. There are relationships for sure, but they're not directly based in our schools. And in my experience too, when I was teaching, is that Boston police officers who would come through our schools were usually there building relationships and in an effort of community policing, for sure. And that's the way that I sort of witnessed it and experienced it and felt it. Again, always as a school, as an adult in the school, and sort of reflecting now through this conversation on my experience as a high school student here in Boston. We had school resource officers as well, who again were very much part of our school environment and our school community. So never saw sort of the conflict that many people are concerned about, I think rightfully so, that they may cause in certain school communities. Is it something that we've got to continue being very careful of and being very aware of? For sure. I don't ever want to feel that in a school setting that I, as a teacher or as a parent now, or that my own children or my students, who my former students I'd refer to as my kids, that none of my kids felt that they were being monitored or watched, or that they felt unsafe because of the presence of uniformed individuals. We've actually talked as a school community about the opportunity to make sure that school resource officers in particular could maybe use or wear a less sort of police uniform. That was there a different way to indicate that they still were playing a particular role in a building, but not so clearly identified as police officers or school police officers or school resource officers, depending on the term that you use. So I am supportive of them in our buildings. I am also, through my role on the city council, very much aware of some of the concerns around violence in our schools, violence finding its way to our schools. I've unfortunately, my years teaching and as a student, have witnessed very violent acts that required significant both police and medical responses, again, both as a student and as a teacher. And actually the last professional development I ever took as a classroom teacher before I left for my run for the city council was on active shooter training. And certainly remember Certainly as not in the classroom, but I remember Columbine, certainly not in the classroom. I remember I was in the classroom during Sandy Hook, and my own children were in school during Sandy Hook, and I need to know as a parent, I need to know as a teacher, I need to know as an elected official that we are prepared to respond to a significant incident in any one of our schools, because our job is to protect our kids, to make sure that our children are safe, that our educators are also safe, that our school communities are safe, and that we are able to respond should there be a large incident occurring on any one of our school campuses across the city of Boston. And we have seen it's luckily, and I'm grateful that it's not a regular occurrence, but we have had occurrences of violence happening in a community, finding its way into our school buildings, but not necessarily directly related to our school buildings. So we always need to be prepared and aware, and I think ready to respond to any significant event of violence, and make sure that we have our children's safety first and foremost in mind.
There's been a lot of talk in the field of education about the issue of learning loss during these double pandemics. And I instead offer that youth have learned much more about themselves and the world that we're living in during these times than a typical year-long school course. So as we make our way out of these pandemics, how do you plan to support learning programs that honor and value youth experiences?
Yeah, it's certainly about sort of the academic learning loss. That's always a concern. I think about it. I think about with my own children who are in the Boston Public Schools. I think about the kids that I represent and their families around sort of the pure academic learning loss that they've all experienced, and how that sets them up for potentially greater losses down the road, especially as compared to their private school peers, their Catholic school peers, and other public school systems who haven't maybe experience the same degree of shutdown or some of the same degree of challenges that many of our kids have faced in accessing their academic experiences, whether it's issues with technology, inadequate access to the internet and Wi-Fi, not great hardware when we think about that technology, not a conducive learning environment when we think about learning from home, and the challenges that, I've got my 4 boys doing school at the same time, and that creates some challenges, but we do have access to, we were able to supercharge our Wi-Fi. The kids had access to higher quality technology, and, when I think about their laptops and their computers, and many of our kids don't have access to those things. And so it's really important that we are measuring and helping our kids catch up from that pure academic loss. But what's also important is the social and emotional losses that our kids have had due to isolation, due to fear, due to poverty and food insecurity that they've experienced over this last year. And as important as it is to catch them up academically, that's going to take a little bit more time. We can't sort of say, let's fix a year of learning loss with summer school. What I think is almost more important for our kids when we think about summer school or an opportunity to catch up with some of that learning loss is to find opportunities to enrich their lives in a different way, to help them in a healthy way reconnect with their peers in a help them sort of also manage rebuilding social networks that have been lost over this last year, to help them become grounded and understand sort of where they are, both emotionally and physically and mentally, because of this last year, and how the impacts of COVID and the impacts of the trauma that continued to exist and the impacts of poverty that continued to exist and the impacts of whether there was a loss of life or tremendous sickness in their own family or in their specific community. We have to understand how those things have impacted them and reground them in the moment that they are in before we can think about helping them regain that academic loss. But we also have to figure out a way to help children regain that academic loss, because they are still, when we think about the workplace, when we think about college readiness, when we think about high school readiness, when we think about sort of all of these pieces, they are still going to be measured against other peers that maybe didn't have the same academic loss, weren't experiencing the same trauma, weren't experiencing the same implications of being disconnected or isolated or food insecure, that others were. That's just the reality of the world and the situation. And we can't say for our kids, because it was difficult for them to log on to the internet, because it was difficult for them to access the curriculum, because it was difficult for them to get appropriate mental health services. We can't say discount this group of kids from the measurements that everybody else's kids are going to be held to when it comes to college application time. We have a lot of work to do. We need to think very creatively about how we use these next few years, because it's not something that just happens, this summer we're going to go to summer school, in September everyone's going to be back in person full time, and we're just going to pick up. You just finished the 9th grade, you're going to be starting the 10th grade in September. No worries. It's not going to happen that way. For some children, especially children of privilege, that'll be a much easier sort of switch to flip. My responsibility, especially when I think about my role, not just as an educator, but as a former educator, but as an elected official representing the children of Boston, I need to figure out what I'm going to do over the next several years to catch this group of kids up, because I worry about losing children. I worry about the impact this has, of course, on them academically and cognitively, and being prepared to take the SATs, to go to college, to go to graduate school, to go to medical school, to go to law school, all of those things. But I also I worry about the effect it's going to have on their income earnings for their life expectancy, because all of what they've experienced this last year will impact their life expectancy, will impact their lifetime earnings, will impact their quality of life. And it'll also impact them academically. So all of those pieces are so important, and we have to be so focused on it. COVID's going to be over by the time this election is over, COVID as we know it today, but the remnants, the implications, all of these leftovers are very, very real. And it's added on to generational trauma that's existed for so many of our kids already. So we've got a great deal of work to do. We've got so much work left undone to begin with. And we've got this, this added trauma and chaos to their lives that we've got to figure out a way to support our kids through this next period of their life.
Thank you. So as we move to election period, we're all faced with the question: how do we overcome the limiting party loyalty to pass equitable policies? Which is to say, in other words, how do we take the money out of politics and make sure that the people, closest to the pain are closest to the power? To quote a very special someone. Is there a way that you think personally to hold elected officials accountable? And in what ways in what ways do you think that'd be beneficial besides a dollar sign?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know. First of all, I think there was a question a little bit about political parties in the earlier part of your question. In Boston, generally we are all Democrats, and we do sort of exist along a spectrum for sure of how liberal and progressive we are on that spectrum. So we have on occasion had Republicans and unenrolled candidates run for office here in the city of Boston, but generally this is a strong Democrat capital D foothold when we think about political parties. And it's also the city election, both at the mayor's level and at the city council level, is nonpartisan. So we don't run as Democrats or not Democrats. And there is it's a preliminary as opposed to a primary. So there isn't when we think about the mayor's race, it's the two top vote getters. It's not the Democratic nominee or the Republican nominee as we see in federal elections. So it's a slightly different dynamic. The question about money is always interesting because there is another saying, I much prefer Congresswoman Presley's saying, but there is another saying that says, I don't know who to attribute this to, but money is the mother's milk of politics. And it is it's a necessary element to running for office, where you do, in order to reach the voters, you need to raise money because you've got to be able to mail them. You've got to be able to communicate with them. You've got to be able to contact with them, to connect with them. You have to be able to hire staff. And we also, I think I want to be able to pay my staff on my campaign side livable wages. And, in order to do that, I have to fundraise, to do media, to compete with other candidates. It costs money. And those that I hire to pull together that video or to pull together a mailing or to pull also deserve to be paid for the work that they contribute. So we find ourselves in a little bit of a sticky place. We have certainly in Massachusetts, and there are some efforts on the federal level, have done a great deal of work to be much more transparent about where money is coming from and what you're spending it on. So in the municipal races at the city council level and at the mayor's level, there is monthly reporting that is required. The state legislature and statewide electeds have slightly different rules that they follow around reporting, but there is a certain accountability and a certain transparency that is expected through this process when money is spent and money is taken in. There are certainly limitations to individual giving, and those contributions have to be noticed and posted with both, especially contributions over a particular dollar amount, have to be noted with, you have to have name and address, and if that person is employed, who their employer is, and that's to manage an abuse of donations. Now, there are independent expenditures. As candidates, we are not allowed to be involved in independent expenditures and what PACs are doing. There's some really bright lines around what a candidate can be involved in, what a candidate can't be involved in. We see the PACs and the independent expenditures very much engaged in national politics, very much engaged in state politics. And my understanding is that they'll likely get engaged in a mayor's race. And that's where, when you have a mailer, you receive a piece of literature at your mail, or there's a commercial on TV, or there's I don't know if it's done as much on digital ads. That's not, I don't know that, but you'll see on the bottom of a mailer, it says paid for by the committee to elect Annissa Essaibi George. Or I'll say, we did a little video at a standout yesterday, and we did a little bit of a spoof, but I was like, I'm Annissa Essaibi George and I approve this message. But that's to signify and to identify who's actually paying for, whether it's a commercial or a mailing. If it says something else, then that's an independent expenditure, and campaigns and candidates aren't allowed to interact with them and do anything on the behalf. A good example of this would be, a couple of years ago, I was endorsed by the Boston Teachers Union, and they did a mailer saying who their endorsed candidates were. And they used a picture, like a headshot of me and the candidates they endorsed. And I was like, oh, I wish they didn't use that picture, but I can't even say to them, please use this picture. I like this one better of me than the other one, because there has to be bright lines between, if someone's spending money to promote your candidacy, and you can't be directly involved with that, or it has to be an expense of the campaign. But it is a lot of money. In the end, we spend a lot of money on political races across all levels of government.
And so, to bring us to our next question, on the topic of reparations, I asked, and I write, there has been much renewed discussion over the past year on the topic of reparations. The book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, which won the Solace 2021 Book Prize, is one important text that advances this conversation of reparations for Black Americans. As the potential mayor of our city, what is your stance on the issue of reparations?
No, it's a great question. Thanks, Christian, for asking it. It's certainly an important part of our public dialogue at the city level, at the state level, and absolutely at the national level. And it's one that we need to have. But I think that there's still a great deal of debate over what reparations means. Is it cash? Is it payments? Is it back pay in effect? But also, is it, how are we being, I think also an important part of the discussion is, how are we being intentional about the work that we are doing forward? Are we making sure that we are not stuck in old racist systems? Are we making sure and being very intentional about shifting the way and breaking down any system that is racist? And when we see those systems, we know what they're rooted in. They're rooted in their roots are in slavery. Their roots are based in discrimination. Their roots are based in racism, just quite literally, and against Black Americans, but also Brown Americans and immigrants. But when we think back into the roots of it, where it initiated from, and that when we look at systems, whether it's the educational system, whether it's the transit system, whether it's the housing system, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's policing, whether it's the healthcare system, and we've seen that. If you didn't think it existed before this year, I hope everyone knows it exists now. And it's about the work that we are doing very specifically, the intentional acts we are doing to break down those systems that are racist, breaking down those systems that are discriminatory, and working together to rebuild them so that they are better. There's conflict. There's always this conflict about these systems, and there's this call to dismantle them, which is the appropriate call, but there needs to be that follow-up call in how we're rebuilding them and who is at the table to help with that rebuilding. And that's the piece, I think, back to Congresswoman Presley's comment around those closest to the pain, should be working on these issues, should be doing this work, should be part of the answer, because they know where the breaks are, they know where the challenges are. So for me, that has to be part of the work that we do around repairing the damage that was caused, repairing the challenges of our past that aren't that far gone, and still too many systems exist today.
I would just like to follow up on that. So you mentioned dismantling some of the systems at play that are legacies of slavery and the Jim Crow era. Boston happens to be one of the most segregated cities in the country. So that already tells us we have an issue with the way that people are housed and the way that people are afforded housing. What policies would you as mayor sort of implement, or what work are you willing to do to kind of mitigate and dismantle these systems that segregate people?
I think one of the greatest challenges that we have faced as a city, that we've created as a city, not simply faced, but created, is high concentrations of lower income and low and lower income housing in only certain parts of our city. Diversifying our housing inventory across our city is a really important piece. But I think more important than that is creating home ownership opportunities. When we think about access to the middle class, when we think about access to some of our quote unquote more desirable communities in our city, it is through ownership. But that has to extend to other elements too. When we think about our entrepreneurs, when we think about our small business owners, we also need to make sure that we're creating ownership opportunities for them to exist across our city. And we often talk about segregation. We think about our school systems. I'm a big believer in neighborhood schools and walking to schools, but that does fly in the face of opportunities to make sure that our schools are diverse, that our student populations are diverse across our schools. And it's not a problem, I don't think, of diversifying schools or desegregating schools, but diversifying our communities, making sure that our residents across the city of Boston have opportunities to live, to grow their families, and to buy homes in every community across the city. To me, that plays a huge role in creating opportunities for moving into the middle class. But I think that also comes from that's not an asset-based way of thinking. When I think about our residents across the city, that is presuming that only our Black families and our Brown families, but for the case of this question in particular, that only Black families are living in low-income housing. We need to make sure that our Black families, when they find the middle class, that they also find that they can make Boston their home, that they feel welcome in communities and neighborhoods across our city where they can buy a home, that they don't leave our city for that opportunity of home ownership. So it's really about diversifying communities and creating opportunities for home ownership, and for our poorer families across our city, making sure that we're working with them day in and day out to find economic opportunity, to find employment opportunities that can pay them, not just to simply live in the city, because that's the struggle number one, but to find and build their home for themselves and their families in this city.
Thank you for that. And just to wrap up our conversation, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the best ways are to hold candidates accountable, to honor their campaign promises.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I certainly, and actually had a conversation with my campaign team this afternoon. We were talking about some school issues. I was like, what I really want, I'll share it with you. I really want every high school freshman, any ninth grader in the city of Boston should step foot on a college campus during their freshman year of high school. We have a wealth of universities and colleges in this city, yet so many kids, if they step foot on a college campus, they happen to be walking through, or they might happen to have a part-time job on campus, or it's their senior year and they're like, oh shoot, I've got to figure out where I'm going to college, and they go on a random tour. It is so important for me that in the ninth grade, I'd love it earlier, that every high school freshman has an opportunity to step foot in a formal way on a college campus here in the city of Boston. And I'd like to go one step further. I think that every freshman should have a college mentor that is attending school here in the city of Boston. That's a pretty lofty goal. It's something that I want to say out loud, that under my administration, this would happen. But we hesitate. I mean, I'm saying it out here out loud, but this is what I want to happen. And I want to make this promise to the people of Boston that as mayor, these two things will happen. But we're internally going back and forth. Well, do I just say it and then hope I can make it happen? I go, no, I need to make sure that I have the plan in place to make it happen. And I hope that the other candidates are also thinking this constructively and thoughtfully and honestly about the challenges that we face as a city, and that we're making promises as candidates. We should make hopeful promises. We should make hopeful statements that we could then follow through with, especially if we make a promise. I've made 3 promises on the campaign trail, only 3, because everything else is hopeful thinking. I've promised that we will make it easier to do business here in the city of Boston. We've got to make it easier to do things here in the city of Boston. I've promised that my first 100 days in office, we will have a strategic plan for Madison Park Folk Tech School. I think that is such a missed opportunity when we think about our school system, we think about our students and the opportunities that Madison Park could give our kids. And the third promise is that I will reconvene the pilot task force, because those are 3 things that I can actually do in my capacity as mayor. And it's 3 things that I've worked towards as a city councilor. So I know that is possible. I think for you and for your efforts, holding candidates accountable to their promise, I don't know whether it's signing a pledge, but I think also as the one that's asking, that you're also asking for reasonable things from us, and recognizing it and acknowledging, although I will have the full power of the mayor's office, which I'm excited about, because having the levers of control that the mayor has on decision-making, on policy-making, on designing their cabinet as an indicator of what their priorities are, that I would follow through with all of those things. But I think it has to go both ways, that the public and those in the roles that you hold, I want to be here with all of you because I like to engage in conversations, and some conversations that are uncomfortable. I think it's important for me as an elected, as a candidate for mayor, and hopefully as mayor, these conversations push me both in my thinking and in what I believe I can do. But I also come here because I know you have an audience that I want to reach. I want your audience members, those that you engage with, to get to know me, because I want them to vote for me because I want to win. But that there has to be a reciprocal relationship where you're asking me to make certain promises that are also reasonable and doable. Because I think that you all were very clear about, there's no gotcha, there's no setup, we're having a real conversation. But too often, some of these conversations do go, well, if you can't promise 2, then you've got no place in this setting. And that certainly hasn't been this conversation today. But that responsibility goes both ways. There has to be reasonable set that, someone on Facebook recently commented, "I'm not voting for you unless you can fix tickets." Well, then you're not voting for me. End of sentence. There has to be a level of collaboration and cooperation. Certainly holding me accountable as the one who wants to lead this city, but we have to have a certain reasonableness. The accountability has to go both ways. So whether it's a pledge, but I think that it's up to the candidate to decide what are the things that they want to commit to, as opposed to just asking me to sign a pledge of 10 things. I've not signed things because I've looked at the list and said, yeah, but these things, on this list of 10 things, 7 and 8 are actually not doable. So I'm not signing the pledge. And then you get knocked because you didn't sign the pledge. You're like, yes, but you asked me to sign something that's not practical, that's near impossible, and I'm going to fail at this. And I want to be honest with you. So anyway, that's that. Sorry, I felt like I preached there for a moment.
Thank you for sharing.
And thank you, Councilor George, for your time this evening. This concludes our series of questions we had for you this evening. Your remarks were mighty insightful, and we look forward to continuing in our next conversation with you. But before we close, we would like to offer a moment for you to offer any final thoughts.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed the setting that you've created today to talk, I think, a little bit more freely and less scripted than some of these conversations are. Usually there's a question and the answer, and I have felt today has been much more of a conversation. I will just add to that conversation is good. Dialogue is great. It certainly helps me learn. I think it helps your listeners learn. And when we can do that together, that's a really good thing. I will say for myself and my leadership style that dialogue and conversation and collaboration is really important, but action has to follow those things. When we are done talking, there needs to be a task list. There needs to be, what are the things we're going to accomplish following this conversation. And so that's really important, I think, for you to know about me, for your viewers and your listeners to understand about me. It's how I run my household. I've got 4 teenagers. That's the only way to run a household. I'm a small business owner. You've got to be action oriented or you're not going to succeed. You've got to learn, you've got to listen, you've got to, engage in those really important conversations, and then you have to make decisions. And as mayor, there are sometimes very uncomfortable, difficult decisions to be made, but somebody has to make them. And as much as you welcome everyone to the table, as much as I will make sure that there are experiences different than mine represented at that table, in the end, as mayor, I've got to be in a position where I can make thoughtful, informed, and difficult decisions. But that obligation, that commitment, that responsibility is mine. And I look forward to having it. I look forward to leading this city. I look forward to us having a continued conversation and that being informed by the young people in your network that you work with. So I'm grateful for this opportunity and look forward to more of them.
And so this concludes our episode. Thank you all for joining us for the second episode of Building Audacity series, Civically Speaking, with Councilor Annissa Essaibi George. Special thanks to our sponsors and the Building Audacity team for organizing this together. And to our viewers, if you have any questions for Councilor George, please submit them to Building Audacity. You can check out buildingaudacity.org and find out in our Facebook and Instagram pages to learn more about our series and our other projects. And so I would like to conclude by saying thank you to everyone, our viewers, our guests. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in our next episode.